Yeah, we can start. Okay, that's fantastic. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this session. Hopefully you're going to find it useful. Did a lot of preparation for this session today. I was in Greece last week in Athens, and I did a talk in the afternoon at about 5:30 p.m., and they're 1 hour ahead of us, so that's pretty much the exact same time as it is now. I wasn't that hungry in the morning. Lunchtime came around. I just wasn't feeling hungry, so I thought, I'm not going to force food in because I don't want to be feeling bloated and stuff. It gets to 5:15. I have to walk on this stage. It's quite a big room. There's a lot of lights in my face. My body starts feeling weak. I feel out of place. My head's like, where am I? Where am I? I keep forgetting where I am. And I'm thinking, I should have definitely had some lunch. So today, I went to a restaurant. I had some oysters. I had some moules frites with fries. I had some bread and butter, and had a cortado to finish it all off. I may have overcompensated a little bit, but I thought, the other approach of not eating doesn't work, so let's see what happens when I go this approach. It might be a good thing, actually. This talk isn't really... it's quite different to my normal talks. I'm normally trying to keep away from the theory and the philosophical stuff and try and get a bit more practical. This one's a bit different. I still think it's quite interesting and useful. But if you see my previous talks and they're more practical, I can appreciate if this one's not quite the same. Anyways, I'm going to get into the content for today, and the first thing I'll say is, if you're someone who is into domain-driven design already, if you're passionate about domain-driven design, if you live and breathe domain-driven design, you might want to look away now, because I'm going to show you what people who aren't into DDD think about DDD. So this guy here, he's talking about DDD's awful. Everyone claims to understand it, but they have their own definitions. Utterly useless, and you may as well use tarot cards to shape your systems rather than DDD. I wouldn't say it's utterly useless. He might be onto something with the tarot cards, but I do agree at the first bit of that comment, he's got some points there. And then this person here, they're talking about a lot of technical jargon, when DDD claims to be about avoiding jargon and managing language. So again, these are some of the comments I do see. I didn't have to look hard for these comments, and they do represent the kind of things people are saying to me. Then we've got this one. Bit weird, but the concept of bounded context is one of those words from DDD I just feel a bit embarrassed about sometimes because it's a bit confusing. And Dan here, he's talking about realms, and Jimmy's talking about linguospheres. That does happen a lot with this bounded context thing. Yeah, people do find it a bit funny. And then there's this quote. So in domain-driven design, there's this concept of ubiquitous language. Now, the word ubiquitous means everywhere. In domain-driven design, ubiquitous language means a language that only exists in a specific area. It's confined to a specific area. So it's not that ubiquitous when you first try and learn this concept. And people talk about this one too. And then also, another DDD thing that people complain about is the tactical side. I've seen a lot of blog posts over the years saying, wow, I inherited some code base, and the previous developers had been into DDD, and I've got no idea what any of this code's doing, and there's 10 times more code than I think there needs to be. So I'm going to stop with the bashing there. I'm not going to bash DDD for an hour. Maybe that'll be my next talk. But even Eric Evans himself realized, Eric's the guy who wrote the DDD book, he, after publishing the book and applying it and learning about DDD and seeing how people are using it, he realized he could have done it differently and changed the order of the book and moved some chapters around to maybe some of those misconceptions and those people applying it wrongly. He could address some of those issues. So I like to think of that as his alternative timeline to DDD, how things could have been different. And I thought, what if I had my alternative timeline? How would I go back into the past and try and address all these problems people have with DDD? And I decided, well, I could move a chapter, I could delete a few chapters, and then I thought, since I'm a person who flip-flops between extremes, what if I just get rid of all the chapters in the book, but I keep one? Which one would it be? And there's a chapter in the book, it's chapter 8, and it's called Breakthrough. And the reason I'm actually giving this talk today, the real reason is I tend to read the DDD book every couple of years, and I always read chapter 8, this chapter about breakthrough, and I think this is such an amazing chapter. There's some real key insights here. If people just read this chapter, maybe they don't get this far, maybe it doesn't stand out in their minds. I don't know why, but for me, this is the chapter that helps to explain a lot of the good things I've seen in DDD, a lot of the benefits I've taken over the years. So you are now in my alternative DDD timeline. I'm going to talk you through this chapter. I'm going to add some commentary and insights to show why I think it's quite useful and how it addresses some of those concerns. I've talked about this idea before with my friend Maxime, and he calls it the hidden chapter, because I think he agrees with me a bit. Not the bit about deleting all the other chapters, but he does agree that chapter 8 is quite an interesting chapter. So I'm going to talk you through this chapter. I've broken it down into 3 sections, got some pure quotes from the book, some of my commentary, and what I'm really hoping is that, like I was saying, nothing too practical to take away, but I do hope that it might trigger some thoughts or things that you're not doing that you could be doing, or just maybe things that you haven't thought about for a while, but this could kick off some thoughts in your mind. So, if you get to the end of the talk and there's nothing immediately practical that you can take away, then I would completely understand that. Anyway, let's get into this. First part of the chapter, I call this intuitions of a seasoned domain modeler. That's not his word, that's my word. So basically, chapter 8 starts with the quotes, after a long New York winter of refactoring. Now, I think that's already quite interesting to me, because I like the winter. It's like always winter here, so I guess maybe you don't like it that much. But, even when I was a kid, I always liked the dark winter nights. It always just felt like something interesting about that. So this first start of the chapter captures me quite interesting. Yeah, he's spent all winter in New York, and he's been refactoring something, and I like refactoring, so I find it quite interesting. But then moving into that quote, he's talking about, we had arrived at this model that captured some knowledge of the domain, and it did some real work for the application. And he talks about they were developing a core part of a large application for managing syndicated loans in an investment bank. You don't need to know too much about the domain to follow this, so don't worry too much about some of the domain terms. The general ideas stand out, I think. So this is what they're working on. And then in the follow-up to that, in the next paragraph, he's giving us some sense of the importance or value or relevance to what his team's working on. So when Intel wants to build $1 billion factory, we're not building some to-do list app here, building a pretty serious application. So if these concepts can apply on something this serious, then maybe they can apply to what we're working on too. I'm just going to quickly restart that. So he talks about when Intel wants to build $1 billion factory, they need a loan that's too big for a single lending company. Oops. Sorry, it automatically starts in this mode. There we go. So basically, a loan's too big for a single company. They have to have multiple companies lending to form a syndicate and a facility. Don't worry too much about all those terms. So then he now gives us some more context about what his team's working on. We're still in the build-up phase here, so nothing interesting's happened yet, don't worry, but it's setting the scene a bit. So he talks about an investment bank usually acts as a syndicate leader, coordinating transactions and other services. And then our project was to build software to track and support this process of coordinating the transactions. So that's what they're working on. And then next, he starts to explain why it's been a long winter. So we're feeling pretty good. 4 months before, we had been in deep trouble with a completely unworkable inherited code base. Who's inherited a code base that wasn't completely unworkable? Someone else's code is, by definition, completely unworkable. So I think that's just for a dramatic effect there. But him and his team, they've taken this, let's say, not well-designed code, it's not aligned to the domain, and they've spent this long New York winter wrestling it into this, what they're calling a coherent model-driven design, something that's more aligned to the domain. But he's showing some satisfaction that they've managed to get this design and the domain model to be into a state they're satisfied with. But we can then see here, they're not quite happy. And the key thing here is, we kept stumbling over unexpected requirements that complicated the design. And again, unexpected requirements, I think that all requirements really at some point, well, not all requirements, but most requirements are unexpected as we build things and we get new feature requests. So I think that's a key thing here. He's saying they're unexpected, but the key thing is, I think a lot of requirements are unexpected. That's just part of building software, especially nowadays. And that's key to this modeling process. Keep that in mind a bit. Anyway, he talks about a specific example. He says, a major example was the creeping understanding that the shares in a facility were only a guideline. So at this point, he's got some feeling of, they've refactored this code over this long winter. They've got the code into a place where they feel it has a model-driven design. But he's feeling like, something's not quite right here. It's still hard to implement new features. He doesn't know what's wrong. Him and his team don't know what's wrong. But they've got this intuition that something is wrong. Things are more complicated to implement than they should be. So this is one of my commentaries here. So I'm emphasizing that in I think, a theme that is going to be relevant to a lot of the work we do. They've implemented the common use cases, and they've built some software model, some domain model that satisfies the common, maybe the 80%, and now they're getting these features that break their domain model. And the key thing here is that in a typical software development team, we might not notice, we might just think we're just implementing these new requirements, we're implementing them in software, and we might not get that feeling of this code is too complex for the software we're implementing. That's a feeling. It's like, I can't explain why, but we spent this much time and this much thinking implementing this feature, and it feels too difficult for the domain problem we're solving. So I feel that that's an intuition that's certainly not common in my experiences. So what he then talks about is they had accommodated this by adding loan adjustments to their model. Don't worry too much about the domain term. We'll get to the key theme shortly. And he talks about refinements of this kind allowed us to keep up as the rules of various transactions became clearer. And again, but the complexity was increasing. And we did not seem to be converging on really solid functionality. So again, this is my commentary here. Think about teams you've worked on. How often do you feel like after implementing a feature, that feature to implement that was difficult and awkward, and it took more effort than it should have? A lot of teams I work with would just think, we've got the requirement, we've implemented it in software, not having that intuition of, this is too complex for the domain we're working in. And so that's my first real question point. How often do you think about that? How often do you think about the code you're working on and thinking, is this code too complex for the domain problem we're solving? Not from a clean code perspective, not from a dry or any of those other principles, but from a domain perspective. When was the last time you thought about that? Thought about, is this code complex for the domain problems we're solving? Do you get those intuitions about the code versus the domain? Is that something you get? I think that's the reason I've pulled this out here is because I think in my experiences, it's not always an explicit thing, but when I'm working with teams that are experienced with DDD, I do see that intuition. I do get that feeling of, something about this code is too complex or not quite right for the domain we're working in. It's not always something you can describe or put your finger on, and that's why I use the word intuition here. So he explains that a bit more here. He explains that he began to suspect that his difficulties were symptomatic of a basic design problem. Again, that's an intuition thing, like something's wrong about our design. We don't know what and we don't know why, but that's his gut instinct. And I think, again, a key thing here is some people, I would say some if I'm working in a team, or if I think about teams I've worked on, and if I feel like there's someone in a team saying, the design's not right here, something's not quite right, I can just see other people saying, that guy is just always obsessing about clean code and pretty domain models, let's just get on and implement the feature. So, how often, where do you feel like you are on that scale? People you work with, do you have those intuitions? Do you value those intuitions? Do you see those intuitions as over-engineering, wasting time? So that was the first part. That was some intuitions, which I think characterize a good domain modeler. So the second part of this chapter, I'm calling this the value of domain-driven software design. So we've got some intuitions so far, and now we're going to see why following up with those intuitions can be useful and it's not over-engineering. So, as the chapter continues, he says, suddenly, one week it dawned on us what was wrong. Our model tied together the facility and the loan shares in a way that was not appropriate to the business. So those intuitions he was getting, he was now able to articulate exactly those two concepts in the code, the way we've structured those classes and methods and data structures. That isn't a good solution for the domain we're working in. Even though the code works, the way we've designed the code doesn't align well with the domain, and that's why when we're implementing new features, it's taking more effort and the code's more complex than it needs to be. So, intuitions have led to this diagnosis. Where do we go from here? So him and his team, they get with some domain experts, they go to the whiteboard, and they start working through numerous scenarios together. So this is being driven by the developers. They're trying to work out how can we understand the domain better so that we can make this code simpler. And also, how can we understand the domain better ourselves so that whenever we're implementing new features, we can always keep things simpler. In domain-driven design, this is where we come to the concept of the model exploration whirlpool. This is one of the practical things you can take away from the talk. It's quite an old concept, but this is how Eric has shared his thoughts on domain modeling, and it kind of matches my experiences. And I think there's a few aspects here. It's an iterative process. Talk with your domain experts, design some model, and then implement it in code. It's nothing too revolutionary. But the key thing I would call out in this, which I would make in huge text in a different color, and I put some emojis next to it, is the bit which talks about, how does he word it? Be concrete and be specific. In my experiences and in my work now, when I'm running any kind of workshop about DDD or figuring out how businesses and domains work, one of the simplest and most effective things you can do is just be concrete and be specific. So a very simple example is, if you're modeling some workflow, you might have customer signed up, customer placed an order, customer specified the shipping, customer received their order. From a high level, that makes sense. And you might feel like, we get this, pretty simple business rules, 4 steps in the process, customer gets their products, let's implement that. But when you start being specific, that's when you start to uncover the real rules and complexity. So in a situation like that, we might ask questions like, what can be different about a customer? Their age, their location, their profession. How might these different ways of segmenting customers affect how the process is carried out? It might be, oh yeah, if we have an older person, they get a discount. If someone's worked in the armed forces, they get a discount. We can then apply that same logic to the order. What kind of orders can people place? Large order, small order, food order, perishable order? That's what we mean by being specific. So whenever you're in a session and you're mapping out businesses and domains, I would say be specific. Try and be as specific as possible. I was in a workshop last year with a company in Germany. All my talks involve working with companies in Germany. I don't know why. They just are the best examples. We were modeling this workflow of a company that is in the industry of sending packages and parcels, delivery. And people were talking high level, and I said, give me a concrete example. And this guy says, some grandma who's sending some shoes to her grandson for his birthday. He thought he was being funny. I was like, no, that's perfect. That's what I mean. Just try and be specific. I find it's much easier to be specific and generalize afterwards. That's how you get to real insights about the domain. So that's what he did here. That's what's happening in the chapter. He's being specific with domain experts, getting into the details, and that's helping them to make that breakthrough in the design. One of the techniques I recommend is example mapping. That's how you can make this kind of be concrete and be explicit, a part of how you work all the time, make it part of your day-to-day thinking. I've got an example that involves this. It's with an Austrian company, not a German company. 100%, I'm not joking to you. So basically, I'm working with this Austrian company. It was also transport related, but this was much more industrial, big lorries sending tons of steel, huge lorries all over Europe and stuff. Very different. And basically, the team was getting requirements from the business. The team has a sprint, 2 weeks to implement those features. At the end of the sprint, the team doesn't deliver anything. Business gets upset. So why is this happening every sprint? Why is the team having a bad reputation? It turns out, when the team starts implementing these features in code, they're like, oh, that's more complex than we thought. We've got more edge cases here. We've got business rules that weren't explained properly. So when the team's trying to implement the code, they're still trying to figure out the requirements. And then the business aren't happy about that because they don't get much done. So we introduced example mapping. Example mapping is a technique. There are different ways you can do this. You can apply it with other techniques like event storming. But effectively, you take a requirement and you try and break it down into various scenarios. The key thing is the way you do this. So the way we did this and the way I recommend doing this is, if you're working in sprints, let's say, or you're working in 2-week iterations, then let's say you're in iteration A, and you're going to be working in iteration B next, nothing too complex there. When you're in iteration B, you'll do example mapping for the features you're going to work on in iteration B. You're only looking ahead 2 weeks, it's not anything waterfall, nothing like that. But what we discovered by doing this is that when the developers found all of these extra edge cases, we could go back to the business and say, you gave us these requirements, we've mapped it out into all these examples, it's a bit more complex than you thought, and we gave them a choice. Would you like us to implement more features and it will take more time, or would you like to take away some of these edge cases and we'll ignore them? So all that discovery the team was doing during implementation, they were now doing that up front, which was meaning less blockers and getting work done in the sprints. Even more importantly, I would say, is that with example mapping, the team's getting into the habit of thinking in these concrete scenarios. They're learning more about the domain. And so even if you can't do things like event storming, which take a lot of effort, take a lot of time, get people together, spending a day, 2 days, example mapping is one of those things that I would say any team, I think every team can benefit from this technique. I'm yet to really feel like it wouldn't work there. It's just a planning technique, a knowledge-sharing technique. So anyway, to get back to the story, Eric and his team had that intuition that something wasn't right. They got with their domain experts, business experts, software developers around the whiteboard, working together, talking through concrete scenarios. And in this example from the book, here's what he means by concrete. So the diagram says that the borrower has chosen to draw 50 million from the 100 million committed under the facility. The 3 lenders chip in their shares in the exact proportion of the facility shares, resulting in a 50 million loan divided among the lenders. The key thing here is that he's being specific. 3 lenders, 50 million, 100 million, plugging real numbers and values into this, not staying too high level. In reality, I would imagine they were even more specific here. They may have even specified 3 real companies and made that more specific. But that's the general idea here. Be specific, concrete values, generalize later. So from this, moving on in the story now, his team had 2 deep insights. The first was the realization that their investments and loan investments were 2 special cases of a general concept, shares. And he talks about different kinds of shares here. The domain here isn't that important, but they made this discovery. They understood that these domain concepts they thought were separate were related in a different way than they thought. So this is where they get to that insight. This is where they start to get some value from this, following those intuitions that people might have thought of as over-engineering or time-wasting. They had a new way of looking at the domain, and they could run through every scenario, and it would be much, as he talks about, relatively effortlessly, much more simply than ever before to implement. So here's the value. By following those intuitions, by caring about the design, by working with domain experts, and by going through concrete scenarios, they found this model which makes it much more easier to implement features in code. That's the value there. And that's what in domain-driven design is called a modeling breakthrough. You get some deeper understanding of the domain you're working in, and that enables you to simplify your code. But there's a problem. No story ends in a happy way after a couple of small ups and downs. There has to be some bumps and dramas and twists and turns, and this chapter has one. It's like, great story, great drama, and here we get to the drama. So they've discovered this new model, but at this point, it's only a conceptual model. It's something on the whiteboard. It's not in the code yet. They haven't implemented it. And the problem is, as he says here, they all felt sick because they've got a deadline, an urgent deadline. They're already behind schedule, so they don't actually have time to implement this new model. Problem that we all face. So that's part 2. That's the value. We can improve our knowledge of the domain, and that can result in simpler software. And if we think about the long-term value of software, if we can make it cheaper to implement new features over time, that will have a huge amount of time saved. When I was in Greece last week, before I almost fainted on stage, I watched a talk by Adam Thornhill, and he's been doing some research on technical debt. And he's published a white paper, done some research, statistically significant, and the number that came out of it was companies are spending up to 42% of their time on technical debt, effectively wasting their time on code that's more complex than it needs to be. And what we're seeing here is one of the ways that we can bring that 42% down by thinking about those intuitions, by trying to keep our domain model simpler. But we still have an unresolved story here, so let's jump into part 3. And this is what I call domain modeling as an investment. We have to give something, and we get something back. So what are we giving, and what are we getting back? Okay, so this part of the chapter starts with the gospel of refactoring, is that you always have to go in small steps, always keeping everything working. Don't make all these big changes and your code doesn't compile. That's a bit crazy. But in this example, in the real world, not in a book, or actually is in a book, to refactor our code to this new model would require changing a lot of supporting code, and there would be few, if any, stable stopping points in between. So a kind of a sub-story here is that, as he talks about, we read books, Fowler refactoring, TDD books, and they're always talking about moving small steps. If you haven't committed your code in like 30 seconds, you have to revert your git commit and start again. Anything longer than 30 seconds, you're in waterfall territory there. But what we're seeing here is, when we're talking about domain models, and we're talking about improving our knowledge of the domain, and that's having a fundamental impact on our model, those small refactorings might not be possible on this kind of journey. So, The next part I find is definitely part of the main storyline. So Eric Evans, he goes to his project manager and he asks him, can we take some weeks to refactor this code to this new amazing model we found? And the project manager says, yes. He says, I'll take the heat for you. And you can see here how Eric's talking about, I've got tremendous admiration for this project manager who made that decision for us. And right here is, whenever I read this chapter, if I'm on the train, I just stop there for a few minutes and I go back through my career and I think about, in situations I've been in like that, could things have been differently where we haven't got permission to do things? So what I'm getting at is, if you want to create good code, it's not just about learning the domain. It's not just about creating better models. But in this situation, he had to get permission from the project manager to actually take some time away from feature work when there was a deadline and refactor this model. Think about the project managers and product managers you've worked with. Would you have a relationship with them where you could say, we need 4 weeks to refactor the code. There's going to be no visible benefits to you from that, but please let us do it anyway. Would you be able to have that conversation, and would the people you're working with say, you know what, I trust you, you're a great person. If you think that's the right thing for this code, I'm going to take the heat for you. So, if you want to be a great developer, we're seeing here, when people talk about soft skills, this is what we're talking about. Being able to build those relationships to make those key decisions at difficult times. Think about what would have happened otherwise. If they would have carried on, they would have built even more features to hit this deadline on top of their old model. It would have been even harder to refactor that model, and maybe it would have never happened. And that would be a shame, because what's coming up next in the story is good. So, Eric and his team, by refactoring their domain model to understand the domain better, they came up with this concept of share pi. If you've been wondering, what's this share pi thing that's in the title of this talk, now you know the answer. So share pi was a concept that Eric and his team came up with. They were trying to make the code improve the design of the domain model so they could implement features easier, and they came up with this share pi concept with their domain experts. And this share pi concept was something that they used to talk about the domain, the developers and the domain experts. It was something the developers had invented, and even the marketing team started using this concept to explain features of the product to their customers. So that's another one of these themes, which I think all of the themes are important. This one, since I'm talking about it now, is the most important. But what I'm trying to get across here is, at the start of my career, for sure, I always felt like software development's a one-way thing. Requirements come into the team, code comes out of the team. When applying domain-driven design, we get requirements, we try and learn about the domain, and implement that in software as simply as possible. But what you can see from Chapter 8 is, when you're building the software, you're changing the domain. When you implement a new feature in your product, you're adding some new capability for your users that doesn't exist yet. You're changing the domain. And therefore, you can introduce new concepts into the domain itself. Not when you add a new concept to your model, you're adding a new concept to the domain. So when you think about things that way, you realize you've got much more freedom than you realize. You can think about new concepts, not just trying to take what the business experts are telling you and using their language. You can go back to them and say, what if we were to call this thing a share pi? They might say, we don't like sharing pi, and they might want to pick a different name, but that's the kind of conversation to have. By asking them clarifying questions about the domain experts might see things differently, and you can be involved in shaping the domain as well. So I think it's a two-way thing. And if you came to my talk earlier, I was explaining this as well, where I think nowadays, the way a lot of teams are working, the whole team's involved in shaping the products. The whole team is contributing new ideas and new suggestions about the domain. So for me, this is from 20 years ago. I think we're just starting to see more of this in the way we work now. And I think what's even more interesting is, over the past 5 or 6 years, I've been to product management conferences, Mind the Product in London. I read a lot of product management books. And product managers are saying the same thing. They're saying the job of a product manager is not to own the product and all the decisions. It's a facilitation role. We have to think about the team we're working with and create ideas together. This isn't software developers saying, hey, we want more responsibility. It's product managers saying, hey, the best way to build a product is for the whole team to work together, for the whole team to understand the domain better. So that's been a very slow transition, but it was all there in that chapter 8, all that time ago. If people lived in my timeline, we'd be 20 years ahead of where we are now, but, don't listen to me. So, quick question for you. Think about Marty Kagan's statement here. He's saying, where's the bit I'm looking for? It's actually not here, but he's got another quote, which is, if you're only using your engineers to write code, you're only getting 50% of value from them that you could get from them. So how do you feel about that quote? How does that match with your expectations, the team you're working in now, teams you've worked in before? Are developers just coding, or are they getting more involved with the product and contributing more? And I think if you've only worked in companies where developers write code, then I would really try and encourage you to apply techniques like event storming or example mapping, because that's when you see that, getting the whole team together, talking about the domain, mapping out existing processes. Everyone has ideas about how things can be improved. Developers, testers, the whole team. And so for me, it's a really obvious thing now. But you might be at a different place in your journey, so that's why I would encourage you to think about that. And maybe if you're a tech lead or a product manager, how could you influence that in your company? How could you get more from developers than just coding? And I would say sometimes developers just want to write code. Give me a Jira ticket, let me put my headphones on, I just want to write some code. It's not, developers aren't just sitting there like, please come and rescue us, let us do more things. It's not that simple. It's a two-way thing. Anyways, I'm going to finish this talk with a few final call-outs from the chapter, which are still a couple of important things to go. So, just weeks after the release of the SharePy version of the software, they noticed another awkward aspect of their model, which was complicating their design. So more intuitions. And the key point there is, if you follow those intuitions and you get to a breakthrough, it's a habit. You keep looking for more breakthroughs. And effectively, what these breakthroughs are, these are breakthroughs in the developer's understanding of the domain. And because your developers keep having these breakthroughs, they understand more about the domain, and that 50% value applies here. When a developer understands more about the domain, not only will the domain model be simpler, but the value they can provide will improve as well. And so this is one of the real key things. This is that investment aspect. So I'll read the quote first, and I'll add some commentary. So our pace of development was accelerating at a stage where most projects are beginning to bog down in the massive complexity of what was already built. So imagine you're at the start of a project. You've got a brand new code base. You've got a Formula One car. It's very easy to add new features. I think we've all had that experience. If you've never worked on a greenfield project before, I do recommend it. And now we all naturally assume that over time, code gets more complex and code gets difficult to work with and things will take longer. I don't know if everyone agrees with that, but I certainly agreed with that a lot before, I think. I think we assume it's natural that over time, it just gets harder to work with the code. But actually, what we can learn from chapter 8 is, over time, the developers are learning more about the domain. And that domain knowledge should actually make it easier to implement new features. So if we have a team aligned to a subdomain and they're working in that area over the course of multiple years, as they get more domain knowledge, they can implement features easier and even suggest new features. So if we invest in those intuitions and those concrete scenarios and having the relationship with our project manager to make difficult decisions, we can improve the speed at which we deliver software. I would add some caveats to this one. I think what's particular about this story is that they're working in this part of the system with lots of complex business rules and workflows. If we're working on something that's CRUD-based, then we don't really have an opportunity to apply that domain knowledge to keep the code simpler. So this doesn't apply in all context, but if you're working in something that's complex in business rules, it's important to the business, it's how they get a competitive advantage, then this is the kind of principle that will apply there. So that's basically it. I've finished the chapter now. I'm going to just have a couple of recaps and then we're done. So if you liked the concept, the principles, ideas, the thought of DDD, but it's not something you've done before, the obvious thing I would recommend is going to github.com DDD crew. It's all open source stuff. It's some ideas and techniques and principles that myself and some other people worked on during the pandemic when we were bored. We're always trying to improve these techniques. We're always trying to make it easier to get into DDD and easier to get value from it. And we always accept feedback. If something's difficult, not clear, feel free to create an issue or a pull request. And then here are 4 quick takeaways from the chapter, 4 things that I think might be relevant to a lot of people, but you might take away different things from this chapter. I think that would be natural. There's a lot of concepts and themes in there. So the first one, going back to the intuitions, is if changing your code is hard, or if something feels more difficult than it should be, maybe it's your understanding of the domain. Maybe you are applying all the solid principles and the Cupid principles and the thing that will come next after those. Maybe you are doing TDD. Maybe you are committing code every 30 seconds or reverting. And maybe your code's still complex, and maybe that's because you don't understand the domain well enough. Secondly, the domain drives the design, but you are working to build features and products in the domain. So you can also shape the domain back. Maybe there are concepts that are missing. Maybe you can clarify those things. Maybe there's a SharePie out there waiting for you to invent it. What would your SharePie be in your company? Thirdly, the investment aspect. Sometimes refactoring codes, it's hard to explain why we're doing that. But as we saw in this example, it can pay off over time. And so if you're struggling to get time to refactor your code or to fix parts of your system, maybe it's the relationships you need to work on. Maybe, and I would say this is a big theme for me this year. I was working in one company and I spoke to the CEO, and well, I spoke to the developers first, and they were like, we've got legacy systems, we don't get enough time to fix it, it's getting worse and worse over time. Now, what do we do here? Then I speak to the CEO. I didn't raise that to him, and he said, all my developers have OCD. They're always talking about refactoring and rebuilding code and new patterns and stuff. And I think that was the trust issue there. I think let's call it the business, they didn't trust the developers. When the developer says, this code is complex and it's slowing us down, the business didn't trust them to actually take that time to refactor the code. The business just thought, these tech nerds talking about tech stuff, get me some features delivered now. So I think that trust, I spoke to an enterprise architect about this, and he was seeing the same thing. I don't know exactly how, I don't have a perfect solution for it, but I think the trust issue is key. If you want to make those big refactorings and decisions, having relationships with the people who are involved in those decisions is something critical, I would say. Did I miss a slide? No, I didn't. So I've got 3 quick questions for you. Don't need to answer these now. Just think about in your head, maybe take away with you. What would your alternative DDD timeline be? What are the problems you see with DDD? And if you could go back in time and change things, what would you do differently? I'm not sure there's anything constructive there. I just thought I'd ask that question, just for fun. And then which part of this talk stands out to you the most? Maybe nothing stands out and it was boring, fine. But if something does stand out to you, why does it stand out to you? What are you feeling? Was it about the intuitions or something else? Maybe just allow yourself some time to reflect on those thoughts and see if there's something you can follow up on that. A lot of the times I go to a talk and something stands out. I'm not sure why, but I just allow myself to think about that and come back to it or make some notes. And that's it. The talk is finished now. I'm going to deliver you back safely into the original DDD timeline where lots of people are complaining about DDD is confusing. People are talking about lots of crazy things. Yeah, welcome back, and thank you for coming on this journey. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. I'm going to get to sleep in my own bed tonight, and I'm so excited about that. Thank you.